diving into a really provocative analysis from the one that actually labels the United States a rogue superpower. We're going to walk through the source material's argument step by step to understand exactly how it gets to such a startling conclusion. So let's get right into it. Okay, wow, no pulling punches here. This is the central claim from our source material, and it is absolutely explosive. Now, just to be super clear, our goal here isn't to debate this claim one way or the other. It's simply to unpack the evidence and the logic the source itself uses to build its case.
So, to really get a handle on this, we've got to start where the source starts, with its very specific definition of what a rogue state even is.
Right, so this definition is the lens for the entire argument. It's the framework they use to look at everything the U.S. does. And as we're about to see, they apply this framework across three main pillars: what's happening with domestic rights, how the U.S. is treating its global allies, and a really unusual take on economic warfare.
All right, let's jump into that first pillar. The source kicks things off by arguing that there's a serious breakdown happening inside the U.S., claiming a constitutional crisis is already well underway.
The source lays out this timeline, starting with the family separation policies, and then fast-forwarding to 2025, where it points to discussions about suspending habeas corpus. That's the fundamental legal right that stops unlawful imprisonment. The text argues that these aren't just isolated incidents. Instead, it presents them as a clear, escalating pattern of violations against constitutional norms.
And here's where they bring in the numbers to try and quantify the argument. They point to over 5,000 children separated, almost 1,500 U.S. citizens that they say were wrongfully detained by ICE, and a record number of deaths in custody in 2025. The whole point here, according to the source, is that these figures suggest systemic problems, not just one-off mistakes.
So the analysis claims that these actions are direct violations of some of America's most foundational legal principles. They cite things like the talk of suspending habeas corpus, deportations that were later ruled to have violated due process, and even the use of military personnel for domestic law enforcement as proof of a constitutional collapse.
Now, this next point is a really crucial and obviously very controversial part of their argument. The source makes a direct structural comparison between the operational characteristics of ICE and the early functions of the Gestapo. It hones in on parallels like operating outside of normal legal checks and targeting political activists. We're showing you this slide exactly as it appears in the source material so you can see the full extent of the case they're building.
Okay, next up, the source argues these alleged domestic problems aren't just contained within U.S. borders. Let's dig into the second pillar, the claim that this behavior threatens the very foundation of global security, NATO. The whole argument here really hinges on this specific bit of language from the NATO Treaty. They focus on that commitment to strengthen free institutions and uphold the rule of law. So the logic here is that if the U.S. is violating its own constitution at home, it is also violating its international treaty obligations to its allies. And to really hammer this point home, the source uses these quotes, which are attributed to the U.S. president. It presents them as direct threats against Denmark, a founding member of NATO, over Greenland. The analysis doesn't see this as just a diplomatic tiff. It frames it as a hostile act that violates the core principle of collective security that the entire alliance is built on. All right, now we get to the third and honestly the most complex pillar of the whole argument. This is the claim that the United States is deliberately waging economic warfare, not against a rival nation, but against the global financial system that it created and leads. So the economic case begins by highlighting this historic drop in the dollar's value. What's so important about this? Well, typically when there's chaos in the world, investors rush to the US dollar for safety. It's called a flight to safety. But the source points out that this time, the dollar fell sharply, breaking that pattern. And according to their analysis, this signals a massive loss of confidence in the credibility of US policy. The source then alleges that a new law called the Genius Act is actually a deliberate trigger for a banking crisis. Here's the three-step process it lays out. First, people start pulling their cash out of regular banks and putting it into new digital currencies called stablecoins. Second, this completely drains the banks of their deposits, which is the money they use to make loans, so lending just stops. And third, credit freezes up everywhere, leading to a full-blown systemic crisis. So here's the really crucial part of how this new system is presented. According to the source, it's designed to look like a cool private sector innovation, basically an escape hatch from the old banking system. But they claim the legislation has hidden clauses that give the government the power to seize assets within this new system, meaning the state is still in control. And again, just like we saw before,
The source draws another incredibly stark historical parallel. It compares this new stablecoin system to Nazi Germany's MIFO bills, which were used to secretly fund rearmament. The alleged similarities? Bypassing the central bank, using a private front to hide what the state is doing, and, the source argues, creating a situation that's designed to end in crisis. And this is what the analysis presents as the final piece of the economic puzzle. The text argues that opening a criminal investigation into the chairman of the Federal Reserve over interest rate policy is a direct assault on the central bank's independence. And that's a huge deal because that independence is what guarantees the dollar's credibility as the world's money. So you have these three pillars: domestic rights, alliances, the economy. How does the source tie it all together? Well, let's get to its conclusion, which synthesizes all of this into one final and pretty chilling warning. This right here is the key idea in their conclusion. The source argues that unlike past rogue states that were outside the global system, the U.S. is acting as an insider threat. In other words, a rogue actor that controls the very system that's supposed to contain rogue actors. According to the text, this is what makes the situation so incredibly dangerous. Think about it. An external rogue state, you can sanction them, you can isolate them, but what do you do when the rogue state is the one that controls the global payment system, the main military alliance, and the world's reserve currency? The source argues it doesn't just break the rules, it tears up the entire rulebook from the inside out. And that's it. That is the final, very provocative question the source material leaves us with. It's a challenge, really, to think about the stability of the entire global system when the very nation that built it is being accused of becoming its single greatest threat.